Yeah.
Awesome. So my name is Amanda Casari. My pronouns are she, her. Today is 23 October 2021, and I'm speaking with Samson Goddy, who I met at PyCon 2 years ago now, I think.
Three,
Um,
3 years?
20, I think it was 2019
Early
uh,
2019.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah.
And I'm recording this conversation for Open Source Stories in what looks pretty dark, but is actually a beautiful sunnyish day here in New England. And my first memory of a computer, uncle worked for IBM in the early 1980s, and he gave us a home PC. It was an IBM PC Junior to have that started living in my dining room when I was a kid. And Samson, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. My name is Samson Goddy. He, him. And today, should I say like today's date, or should I just skip
Yeah,
that?
you could
Yeah.
skip that.
So I'm recording from London, United Kingdom, but I'm Nigerian. I'm from Nigeria.
Cool. And what's your first memory of a computer in your life?
Oh, so my first memory was basically back in grade school. We had like the first moment to like see computers, and it was pretty awesome because why I didn't get the vibe at the beginning because we were taught to like use like Microsoft Offices. That was like pretty bad for me. But I think when I went back after the class and I watched some sci-fi movies, and I got pretty excited about the possibilities of what you can do with computers rather than just office work. Maybe it's just me saying that I don't like the traditional office work with computers.
Do you like office
Yeah.
work with computers now?
Yeah, yeah, because my job is part of it now. I have to spend much of times on spreadsheet, Google Docs, and some bunch of tooling as part of my job. But compared to when I was much started, I was like more into like use cases, programming, and some other tactical things rather than just the office work. So yeah, one of the things I was running away from is like something I'm catching up with now. So always learn as much as you can when you're much younger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of learning things you can while you're young, can you first
Mhm.
maybe describe your first encounters with open source and a little bit of your early journey with it?
Yeah, sure. Interestingly, when I became very tactical about, I mean, when I saw computer from a tactical level, um, luckily for me, I got introduced to the tactical world of programming in, I think, as early as grade six or grade seven. I'm not sure when. And then that was true. Again, that was a little bit different because I was not looking at the Windows computer because I was kind of fed up with those things. I couldn't resonate with it at that point. So there was a popular project from the MIT Media Lab and I think with the United Nations at some point called the One Laptop per Child project. So I got introduced to that, like I said, within my grade six to grade seven. I think was it grade six, grade seven actually, maybe grade seven. I feel so, and then that's how I got interested into open source because the full, I mean, it was running a full Linux machine, like full Linux desktop, and of course the Linux desktop is open source. So that's how I started, understanding what is open source. It's a very different culture for where I'm from. So having to make more research and like, out of frustration, anyways, because my peers at that time was using Windows for some gaming. I'm big into like football, which the Americans call soccer, which I forgive them for. Anyways, so I was a little bit frustrated in like trying to get some of those PC games that I was used to over to my computer. They were pretty slow, and also there were limitations of the actual architecture of the desktop itself. So that got me interested in like I want to fix these things, and why am I not running exe files or why I'm not running Windows files? So I got to understand the concept of operating system, and through that process, I got to understand what open source is and like how like there are multiple distros out there.
So when you were looking, so you were first getting started in grade school, and none
Yeah,
of your friends were interested, it sounds like, in the same kind of technology platforms you were using. How did you
yeah.
find support and community for that, for figuring things out?
Honestly, it was hard. It was hard because, well, yes, I was in the same school, and to give it context, the project was for the whole school, so I was not just the only person with that computer, but I think I was one of the fewer people, probably like the 0.1% of the people that resonate with the computer at that time. Because, like I said, right, I'm someone as a child or when I was much younger, I was very, very into breaking things and fixing things. I'm always want to know things behind. I mean, an average kid would want to do that anyways. But I was more into like having to get to the bottom of it. Like I'm always want to know what's happening over the hood. Um, so I think for me, the community was interesting from a high level standpoint because the computer was in my school, so they were able to incorporate some of the Linux apps or
Mhm.
the we were running Sugar. Sugar is sort of based on Fedora or the GNOME desktop user interface, anyways. So there was some educational project that came from the Media Lab as apps, which we call Activity over the Sugar desktop environment, and some of the activities were sort of incorporated in my school curriculum temporarily in a way because Slummager was running a program, so the school was able to accommodate some of those programs. So one of it was the early version of Scratch. Scratch, like one of the early version of it, was definitely way different from what people are using today. Those are one of the tools. Some of the depending on how back you've been on the Python side, one of the earliest implementation of the logo which is like using Tortoise to draw circles and square and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the things I was more into at that time, and that's why the graphical programming language was something that I started with because the computer was more equipped for that before going into text based. So the community was due to the way the computer was shaped and the vision for it. It's not African centric. It was not optimized for my environment because of the influence of what they think computer science is or what computer is to them. It was a little bit different. So that got me moved or got me pushed over going to the internet and going over to forums. And that's how I got introduced to the open source project that was based on that was obviously supporting the OS. And that's how I got to know what IRC was. Funny enough, I know what IRC first. I got into IRC before understanding what messaging was on phone.
Yeah.
So it was quite interesting because I was like, okay, this is not a bad interface because that's how I got interested. My first exposure to like real time messaging was IRC before understanding what SMS was and other things, which is quite funny.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
And so when you were doing all of this work that so as a student trying to find things,
hmm
figure things out, get connected as part of the
hmm
community, was there anyone
hmm
in particular who was super influential as a part of your journey?
Yeah, sadly, 99.9% of those folks are in the US because, like I said, right, due to how low of the adoption of the Linux, and desktop, or in this case, PC desktop, which is still not so much of a impact these days, anyways. It was pretty low. It was Windows dominated environments. Yes, I was able to get support from. Um, some of my key folks from like the Schlumberger program, which was more focused on the educational side of it, not necessarily what the computer was all about. But I think from the tactical side of the project, I was more closer to folks over at MIT Media Lab. So Cynthia Solomon, which was one of the authors for the logo programming language, which the Scratch and other tools came from. Another big person, Walter Bender, which also influenced my career and also helped me to understand the methodology around like learning while doing and the concept behind what the folks over at MIT. So at that time he was, I think, the president of the MIT Media Lab. So I was more optimized for folks over at the Media Lab and some folks within um, Harvard also. So kind of like an edutech or edtech influence, but more optimized between these two universities. So that's how I got. That's where my supporting system was coming from before eventually going into the raw open source project and the community, and then starting to talk to a lot of people that were the user of the project, and then were able to share ideas and improvements.
Yeah. So you said several times that you felt like your experience initially was centered in the US, was centered on
hmm
US needs. And
hmm
I know that that you've done a lot of work to change that. Can you tell us
hmm
a little bit about like how did that early experience influence
hmm
your life now and what and your
hmm
work?
Yeah, like I said, right, I was technically forced to optimize for the US because that was where I was getting my supporting system from, anyways. And why I was doing that and why it was great for me at some point to get to understand, being in Nigeria, understanding a different culture, which helps me in terms of like better diversity. At some point, I started feeling alone. I started feeling alone because I wanted some real time improvement. I wanted people to talk to. I do have some friends that were in the same, like I said, the 0.1% of the people that were into that were able to form some groups, but then that was just us. And some of them had to change their mentality as they grow, with different views and whatever. And of course, there's always going to be that time you grow out of your, early child friendship and all that, which is a universal thing, anyways. I think as much as I started interacting with a lot of people abroad, I started seeing how I could start forming community over in Nigeria. And it was, to be honest, it was pretty, it took me a pretty long time, to be honest. I'm saying about between grade seven and up until I would say, um, I think when I was out of high school. What I was doing at that time was more of like speaking at events and going to universities. At some point, I even became a guest lecturer for one university over in my school as a high school graduate, which was pretty interesting. Introducing what computer science is with Python and Scratch, and you know by doing all those things, it kind of shows that okay, I need to start building a community of people around the same, not necessarily the same mentality, but also in the same interest. And I didn't actually get the right framework to do that because when I was much younger, I'm also kind of very introverted also at that time. I'm so into myself and trying to be as low key as possible. I think it remained until I attended my first tech gathering, which was not my own version of tech because again, it's a very different. It was more optimized for the needs in Nigeria, which is like very super into like fintech and banking. Anyways, I did attend the conference and I saw some people not in the same level where I was thinking, but somewhere around what I could identify as. And I was like, okay, cool, there's a value for this. And then I started optimizing people around me in my community. I started with people closer to me to start forming this group. And the first time I went over to the US, which was quite interesting, and it was from Google, the Google Sum of Code mentor, no, sorry, Google Sum of Code mentor summit was the first time I came to the US. So I went straight to Mountain View and I saw a community of people. From a racial standpoint, I'm not into like, oh, there are going to be a lot of black people over there. I'm not that kind of person, but I saw that, okay, this is something that I could fix because I mean, the fact that I'm here, there could be more people that can be here also. So I noticed there was a pipeline problem. So I spoke with the team at that time, talking about what are the ways that I could optimize, going to like evangelize around where I'm from, and then going back and then moving around all that over to the States, going to MIT for the first time, going to Harvard for the first time. That just kind of shows me that the importance of computers is more into collaborations than people. So I started seeing the value of people, and that started shaping my ideology of like, okay, there's a lot you can do from the people standpoint. So going back home, that just opened my ideology and started looking for people that had similar interests of building a community of people and then centered around particular conversations. Then I started, mingling with those kind of folks, and then we started building something. And that's one of the things that came out of that. That was fruitful because I've done some things that failed actually. Was the Open Source Community Africa, which is one of the projects that I'm really, really excited for. Started sometime in like late 2017 when I came back from the US and officially became a thing in like early 2018. And now we're pretty big and pretty good actually.
Yeah. So open source community Africa. Africa is a continent, not a country,
Of
unlike
course,
some
of
people in the
course.
US think, right? So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
really so as you've been doing this now for about 3, 4 years of like trying to
Hmm.
figure out a continent wide program, what have you
Hmm.
learned about things that are standardized or that you insist on doing the same, and what needs to be localized or different based on the communities that you're working with?
Yeah, you just said it yourself. Africa is a continent, but it's a very unique continent in a way because why it is continent and that could be comparable to Europe, to Asia or to to both North and South America and other continents that I might not remember now. Trust me, I used to be a good student at some point, but
Antarctica is in
yeah,
there somewhere too, right? So
yes,
yeah,
somewhere, right?
yeah.
Africa is very unique in terms of like complete diversity. Even at some points, even on the racial side, where the North is pretty different, the South is pretty different, the East and the West is also pretty different. But then there's one thing that is in terms of diversity, there's two major problems, not problems, but two major quote unquote challenges when it comes to like building communities. One is language, and two is cultures or religion. I would say more of like culture plus religion, because some religion might feel standardized. I would say, oh, I'm Christian, but then Christianity could be something different from a different state or a different place in Africa. So sometimes I always say culture and religion coming together to form uniqueness, right? So for me, one of the things I was optimizing for was the religion side of things. I know for a fact that people think different things and they have different morals, and depending on their background, they have different ideas. And then the concept of open source is very generic, or I would say it's very Western centric. And from those places, they are all either, for someone that is moving over to the States. For the first time, is kind of optimizing their life to be feared in the society. That means they are unlearning what they know, from where they are coming from, and trying to adapt into a new society so they could be law-abiding citizens, right? That's a pretty normal thing. But then, given the fact that these things are more designed from a one standardized effort, that kind of means something different over on the continent here because of how different people are. Giving is something. The concept of volunteering means different things from different angles. Some people are okay with it. To tell you how interesting that was, I remember the early stage when I was talking to my early members. It was like, hey, we're going to be doing most of these things for free. They were like, what? Who does that? And I was like, yeah, like I've seen it over in the Western world. They're like, yeah, that's the Western world. I was like, yeah, but how do you learn? They're like, okay, I need to have money. I was like, yeah, who would hire you to learn in the job in Africa? Think about it. Now, there's a bunch of things that was one of the early conversations when I started. So I think we started optimizing for building local cities, right? I started with my city first. That was the first place we did the open source community chapter events, and then we did one or two, and then we saw that people were so interested, and then we moved over to Lagos, which is like the biggest city, one of the, if not the biggest city in Africa, by population, not by size. It's a very small city, trust me. But then there are a lot of people in there when it comes to diversity of thought, and then that was one of the biggest real challenge at that time. So doing a successful event there and seeing how people are not arguing what the concept of open source is, but bringing their own ideology on how to better it and better suit it in that environment was something that was a plus. So we saw the value of people not trying to fix or trying to erase what is upstream, but better trying to understand how the upstream affects the downstream that when it comes to the society. And that was a huge value for us. And so we started optimizing for like local cities within the continent, and then we now start having our own version of what open source is. So what I normally do is to go to open source projects, because I'm one of the privileged folks. I get to travel to conferences and I get to give talks and say, hey, this is how we see open source in Africa, and this is how people, if you want to do something over there, this is the way you need to start thinking. It's not a country, it's a continent. There are multiple languages. So if you're doing these things, you don't have to say, oh, Afrikaans is a popular language in Africa. I don't happen to speak Afrikaans, for example, right? So there's a lot of things that it started becoming more of an awareness standpoint whenever I'm in the continent. And when it comes to Africa, it's now more of an adoption strategy where I do things, right? So that's how I've been able to like bridge what is standardized and what we're trying to like localize in this standpoint.
What are you most excited about for the next few years from the work you've been building up to at this point and where
Mhm.
you're imagining things to go?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I saw real time, I mean, I've been seeing it from a smaller piece standpoint, and I'm someone that I can be pretty hard on myself to know whether I'm successful or not. Was when I did the festival for the first time, because that was my biggest gathering locally that I planned it myself alongside my colleagues in over in the continent. We saw the impact even while during the lockdown during COVID, to show how much of an impact most of what we did was pretty crazy. Like after the festival, a week after, everywhere was on lockdown, and there was a lot of bunch of challenges. But then people were getting jobs, people were changing, you know, careers. People were, there was just a massive explode. And then the interesting thing about why I think we're seeing these changes is because there are a lot of people that like myself within the younger age brackets, and this is not what you see in the Western world. Nigeria, as a country, about 70% of the population are probably under the age of 30. So that means they're very energetic. They are very experimental. There's a lot of things that they want to do. They are so trying to do things to fail, learn, and always going through that route compared to what you see over in some of the Western world that are trying to play safe or trying to follow a particular path, right? So there's always that experimental vibe that is going on the continent. I think that with what I've been able to do, I've been seeing a lot of impact. People sending me DMs and telling me, "Hey, I listened to your talk, or I'm part of this community that you referred me to, and now I'm this." There's a bunch of developers advocacy. There are a bunch of people working for like fan companies, working at Google, working at a bunch of companies that are like, 5 years ago was kind of a joke to them when I tell them, "Hey, you can work at Facebook." They're like, "Me, work at Facebook?" This is just a funny bunch of conversations. But then things are every single day now on Twitter. I just go and start putting congratulations every time on Twitter because there's someone leaving the country to a new country to join a new job or working remotely and all that stuff. So I think they've been a huge impact when it comes to optimizing for people to see how they can self grow without having to like go through some bunch of roadblocks.
Yeah. I remember I remember going to Nigeria for the first time for the festival, which was
Yeah,
I'm so glad that I made the decision to do that before everything locked down. And we
yeah,
had, in all the airports, like the US was at the time in early 2020 was like, oh yeah,
mm,
we're fine. And then as soon as I leave the country, it was like medical forms and fever checks and a hand sanitizer in all of the airports because there was an entirely different expectation
of
of
course, yeah,
what was happening in the world. And I
hmm
remember your team was working so hard for this really large event that
hmm
that grew, I would say, what, 2 or 3 times bigger than you expected it
yeah,
to, right, with all
yeah,
these
yeah,
people together. And then
yeah,
afterwards, I know was probably in recovery mode for
hmm
for a little while, because
yeah, yeah,
I flew back to the States, and as soon as I
true,
flew back, everybody went into lockdown.
true, true,
So I do look back on that time. I'm so happy that we got to spend that time together, and that I'm so
true,
honored that you invited me to be a part of that, because
yeah,
I also have been watching on Twitter, and I'm like, holy cow, these last 2 years have been this
yes,
explosive growth
that's
for a lot of
yeah,
especially a lot of the organizers and
this,
people
yeah,
on your staff. And it's been so lovely to
yeah.
see.
Yeah,
Um,
literally everyone that planned that conference or volunteered at some point, got a job, and because again, the story was big. The companies that supported us were very influential, and the buzz on Twitter was so big that you can't ignore. I remember going to some conferences, even now I'm in London for a conference, and someone was talking about what we did in 2020. So just by talking about it, and even if interestingly, like one of the things that even got me my current job, which is pretty interesting, was when I finished the conference. It took me a while because I was recovering. There was a bunch of things that was going on personally. And when I wrote an article about some things that I've been doing prior to the conference, and I was in this interview phase, I just took the article and said, you know what? If you want to hire me, this is the reason this is the reason you want to have me in your team, right? And then I forwarded that doc to my now manager, and she read it. She's like, holy shit, you need to be in the team and all that stuff. And even the same thing also applied to other companies that I was interviewing for. But luckily I was able to get this one. But the part is the conversation was so big that if you're not seeing it, it's like probably on the rock or something, or probably not on social media.
I also love how not just the professional paid growth, but it also
hmm
seems like a lot of the folks who you introduced me to and who I met.
hmm
There's also
hmm
been this really wonderful change
hmm
in everybody's interaction in leadership
True.
positions,
True.
where
True.
and you and I had this conversation early on that it wasn't
hmm
just a billion users. Your goal wasn't
Yeah.
even a billion developers, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
fundamentally changing who has a voice and who gets to be a leader, not only in
Sure.
technology, but in like open source ecosystems.
Each time, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. No, go on. Sorry.
no, please.
Okay, yeah, I think that was the exact same thing that we were trying to optimize with on the conference. Bringing people like yourself and people in the industry that have done amazing work, and then also people listening to people that look like them, for people that care about racial side. I'm a very generic person, so I'm just gonna put it that way. But like, there's a lot of things that people care about, and we listened. We did a lot of polls and like, hey, what would you care about coming to the conference? Why would you want to come sit with us for 2 days, right? And then we listened, and then we try to optimize the event. The speakers' choices, the topics, the way it was designed was to kind of answer as much questions as possible. And then one of the things that I saw there was like, the same thing I tried to. And then I think I spoke at some conferences after that event, and I was so specific about that. Is that my vision for me and what I'm optimizing the people around me for and the events or conferences that I'm doing or the programs that I'm doing and even in my job is to always create a system and this is something I've been seeing as a newly corporate leader sort of right is that I love when people are in the same room and they're not looking into the differences by age, race, languages, cultural disabilities, but more into like how do you impute like bring in as much diverse thought as possible and then build something from scratch. That was something that I was more focused on when we were setting up the organization and bringing people in because of course there was a huge gap between where I was, my co-founder, and some other people than the other people that came. Not naturally, we want to kick in the human instinct and say, okay, listen to me and then do this. Listen to me and then take this tax. I mean, that works. There's a form of leadership, and we can make an argument about why that can work. But then there's, from a continent or from a country where a lot of people are culturally, emotionally, or the way the Africanness of them are conditioned them to listen every single time. And then sometimes they feel like their voice is not being heard. So creating that system and say, okay, you can actually speak out. Now that's why it's very natural for you to see someone say, oh, I'm now a developer's advocate because they know for a fact that they cannot just code or not just do something about their stuff, but they can actually talk about that and share that knowledge, right? And that's one of the things that we've been seeing, product designers, people basically doing things that aren't necessarily telling them to talk about their job, but you always see them talking about it from a leadership standpoint. And I think that's something that is pretty amazing, actually.
So, what are you most proud of from your work in open source so far?
I would say impact in terms of I think charging from when I started and I think where I am as of right now. I think every single thing that I was consciously trying to optimize for is to say, how do I go in here and how do I make the most impact? And most of the time, sometimes it could be unfair to me because I have to give up a lot of things to do that. Sometimes it could be me talking from a selfish standpoint. But then the most important thing is to having to see the human capital, especially on the continent, trying to see the improvement. And those are the things that gives me joy. By having to, I remember a lot of things that I had to go through in order to like run some events. At some point, I was sponsoring. I mean, I still do, anyways. But like at some point, I was sponsoring some of the events. I randomly just go on Twitter and I buy courses and I do a lot of things with people. And the reason I'm doing that is not to feel good about myself, is to know the fact that okay, once there's better human capital, there's going to be more ability to listen to more people and get into better yourself. So I see it as more of like investing in people so they would go learn and then share something that I would want to learn in the future. And so it's kind of a win-win situation and how I see things in that angle. So
So, the flip side of that, Samson, this might be a very personal question, is what is your biggest regret?
huh, interesting. I think my biggest regret would be interesting. So I look at two things that I think might not necessarily be regret now is I've always optimized to be or maybe something I could do afterwards. But I've always wanted to teach in university setting. Like it's always something that I've really been curious of because that's how I started my career. And I was optimizing to go to MIT at some point, but I never did due to some personal reasons. And I think those are one of the things that I felt like and it could be many things because I felt like if I had go to MIT when I was trying to go to MIT, none of these things would be happening now. I'd just be one of those exports that went over to the States and do things and affects the US community, which is also great because I always loved impacting things over there. But I wouldn't see a lot of values in there because I felt like, you know, nature kind of made it so that I remained on the continent at that time and I did what I wanted to do. But I think for me is having to keep things to myself for a very long time to realize that community was important. I mean, I was pretty young. I was like pretty young. I mean, what did I know at that time, right? But I feel like having to know community from the time I did, and imagining when if I was introduced to it a little bit much earlier, the impact I would have made because now it took a while and now it's happening now. I can imagine it happening years ago and now it could be more of like the maturity stage, not people reacting and all that stuff. So for me, I don't think there's a much of a regret because I feel I have this belief that things happen for a reason.
Mhm.
Because I've looked back a lot of options that I would have taken, going to corporate jobs, taking jobs. I remember if there was a company that was trying to hire me pre Oscar fest, and I remember if I did take that job at that time, I don't think Oscar would have been happening, and then that would have had a different impact, and I wouldn't be where I am today. So just a bunch of things that I look at and just see it as like, okay, that's life, it's life, and yeah.
Yeah. I saw this, movie one time where and it was, like, the super low budget version of a time travel movie where in order for somebody to time travel, they went into a closet and,
Yeah,
like, thought about it. Um, but
yeah,
but it was
yeah.
interest the it was more of a plot device that I remember,
Mhm,
it was more to bring up the conversation that there are pivotal moments in your life that if you go back
mhm,
and change something really before then, like, your whole life is different afterwards, right? So
mhm.
this person
Yeah,
had to really make these decisions around some pivotal moments that they wouldn't
mhm.
wanna change in the future. Um,
Exactly.
I mean, and it sounds like you have at least one of those. I'm curious, is
Mhm.
there anything else that would stand out, in your mind, not just for you, but maybe for open source in general as, like, this is something that has changed the way open source looks now and the way that it's going to look in the future?
Yeah. So I think is this like on the regret side or is it more of like the optimizing for the future? I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, yeah. So I think just in general, it sounds like there's been like when we talked about regrets or we talked about like things you're proud of or your journey so
Mhm.
far or what's inspired you. There's kind
Mhm.
of been these like key decisions, key moments that you can tie things back to. So
Mhm.
even regrets, you're like, okay, I regret this, and I know that if this was different, I wouldn't have done this thing, and if this thing was different, this thing
Oh,
wouldn't have happened. So I
sure,
wonder,
sure,
like,
sure.
taking a step back from your experience and from the specific communities you've been working with,
Mhm.
as you think about like global open source in general, or open source with your experience with the African community. I know you do
Mhm.
work with Sustain and the OSI, but is there anything that kind of pops out for you as to like, oh yeah, I remember this one thing happened, and then the whole community was talking about it, and I have either you do or do not have a strong opinion about it. It's totally cool. But
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
what stands out in your mind as like a pivotal moment or something that's happened that you think has influenced like way open source is now or will be in the future?
Oh, nice. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think for me, right, one of the things that going back, if I could fix that could maybe better optimize was me constantly belittling my effort because I started the journey on a solo angle. I mean, from a real time, except from the IRC side of it. Um, and I felt like because I wasn't talking about it, and like I said, right, if there's any regrets in this case, it would be me not talking about what I've been doing for a very long time. I think I started seeing the value of it when people around me started doing it. Like people around me, not in my community, but like over in the States, started sharing. And I started seeing the value of sharing. And I felt like if I was optimized at that time, there would have been more impact and there would have been more growth. And I would have done things a little bit earlier and things would have been more matured. And those are the things that I see here because, again, I have this thing where I just constantly just say, okay, I mean, it's cool I did that stuff, but it's like nothing, right? It's like that's one of those stuff. And because of the way I grew up from a very military background, so you sometimes want to just take things as like, okay, I did that stuff, but it's cool. And then as a child, I was much optimized to understand that things are a little bit different, right? So taking credit was not much of something that I was more optimized for it. I felt like that alone had a lot of impact
Mhm.
where I am today and where I'm gonna be. So like recently I started optimizing for trying to say, okay, I mean you did this stuff, it's cool, it's okay, it's fine, you can take credit for it and you can actually talk about it, right?
Mhm.
And that itself has been able to change. And I think one of those biggest impacts was when I did a project with GitHub. It was really interesting because I flew over to the States and I was hosting a panel section called the Open Source Africa's panel, I believe. And then some of the folks over there internally were like, "Hey, we're trying to launch this README project that would, you know, give more maintainers or individuals to share their story." I remember spending up to like a week trying to figure out what I wanted to say because I just dropped my thoughts in there and I keep deleting stuff. I was like, no, 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 that's too personal. And that took a while. Like my story was pretty crazy, but then to get it and then when they did, and then they shared it on the within their platforms, obviously they saw a lot of big impact because that's one of the biggest, based on what they told me, that's the biggest story that they covered. But also with me, a lot of people could get more insight about what I was doing. So there was a less of a confusion and that also helped them to like project the career and that got more impact. So I think these are one of the things that I see that the more confident that people within my society becomes, and to be able to take credit, that kind of like affects the general open source side because they could now go out there and talk about their story, go to conferences and talk about tips and tricks or like ideas, and then that would also affect the global side by understanding that okay, there's this side of this world where we have not been optimizing for and we need to start fixing our problems and start making sure that there are more contributors coming in there, not just contributors but becoming maintainers, and then by them maintaining that also create a ripple effect and bringing more people in. So I think those are one of the things that I would kind of tie back to me not taking credit or not me doing a bunch of stuff. So
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm so sorry that we only actually have about a few minutes left. And
mhm,
so before we have to end,
mhm.
I first of all, I just want to ask, do you have any parting thoughts that you would want to put out into the world as a part of this discussion?
Share as early as you can, actually. To be honest, I think I see the power of sharing. The power of sharing also give good power of network because the more you talk about what you do, because again, this is the internet age. Maybe it would have been a little bit different if I was born pre-internet age. Luckily, I didn't, so that would have been much harder for me. But I feel like with the internet age and the way people are using social media, like sharing your story would just be a really big impact to someone's life, and I've seen that happen. And that's one of the things that does in this case is making sure that people advocating for you behind doors. Is like a friend of mine wrote an article saying who is speaking on your behalf. People can't speak on your behalf when you're not talking about yourself, right?
Mhm.
So I think that that's a pretty interesting one.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that idea of not just sharing your story, but also sharing other people's stories when they're not right in front of
So
you. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, thank you, Samson, so much for joining the conversation today. It was awesome to hear
sure.
you talk about so many things we hadn't talked about before.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited. I'm always happy to talk about, Africa and like open source. I mean, love the fact that I, always been in open source and looking forward to see more collaboration going forward. Thank you.
Awesome.
All right.